that people who fall into this are actually victims. That does not mean that they are innocent. It does not absolve them of their actions, but I think it's a useful approach because the real goal should be to not have to smash any fascists ever again.
Today is Sunday, April 11th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I am your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor. This is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition, and we are entirely listener-supported, so if you like what we do and you want to see us grow, the single best way you can help support the podcast is by becoming a paid subscriber on our Patreon page. That is patreon.com/No Easy Answers. Thank you to all of our Patreon subscribers. Y'all really do keep this show going, and perhaps one day we will have some bonus content for y'all, but today is not that day because I do not have anything behind a paywall. You know, I started doing this podcast because I'm a musician, I am a songwriter, but all of that, music in general, started to feel a little insufficient around the time COVID hit, and I felt like our society desperately needed to have specific conversations that did not settle for easy explanations. And so my goal in publishing these episodes is to present you with a discourse that is enriching, that hopefully leaves you with something that enhances your way of making your way through the world. And so it just seems like placing any of that content behind a paywall, it just sort of runs counter to any of these aspirations, especially for a show like this that, so often presents topics through the judgmental gaze of critical theory. So if you can't commit to a monetary donation, I totally understand, and you're not missing out on anything. Plus, there are a ton of other ways you can interact with the show. Check out our subreddit, check out our Discord, follow us on Twitter, like our Facebook page. You can always send us an email at noeasyanswerpodcast@gmail.com. And you can also, I'm really tired of saying this at the top of every show, man, but it really does help us expand our reach. You can also leave us a positive review in Apple Podcasts or in Audible for those of you listening to us on that platform. Leave us a 5-star review, maybe a few words, and that really helps us with the occasional 1-star review we receive from people who, shall we say, take umbrage at our conversations. All right, with all that out of the way, I want to send a huge thank you to our guest, Laura Jedeed. She is a journalist, writer, opinion haver, and videographer covering the far right in Portland, Oregon. I want to encourage listeners to go into the show notes and check out the link to her article titled How I Got Here. Laura's life story, her radicalization into left politics, and her work as a journalist covering the far right, all of it is fascinating. And so I want to thank her for taking the time to meet with me to talk about the far right. And as you hear, we spend some time talking about her childhood and being born to parents who followed objectivist philosophies, the time that she spent embedded within the far right group called Patriot Prayer. She was an observer while she was writing her thesis, and so many other things. So check out her article. It's called How I Got Here. I left a link to that in the show notes. So let's get to our monologue and then our interview with Laura Jedeed. In May of 2019, far-right and anti-Islam activist Tommy Robinson had a milkshake thrown at him for the second time in 2 days as he campaigned in Warrington, Cheshire. At the time, Robinson was running as an independent to become a member of European Parliament for the northwest of England. Footage posted on social media showed him arguing with a man before the milkshake was launched at his head, to which Robinson responded by throwing several punches at the man who threw the milkshake before they were separated. The person filming the event can be heard yelling, "That's what you get for being a fascist." UK Independence Party candidate Carl Benjamin was milkshaked 4 times while campaigning. Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage was milkshaked later in June, and a few days later after that, he found himself trapped on his campaign bus after arriving in Kent to speak to supporters, as a group of people holding milkshakes watched nearby. In the same month, the first instance of milkshaking happened in the United States as Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz met with protesters while leaving a town hall in Pensacola, Florida. All of this sparked a ridiculous and befitting conversation. Call it the ethics of milkshaking. So, in the spring of 2019, for a brief moment, the biggest topic in British political circles wasn't the country's impending departure from the European Union, it was milkshakes. Now, throwing a milkshake at someone is rude at worst and considered an assault in some jurisdictions. I mean, the act of milkshaking was condemned by then Prime Minister Theresa May, saying that politicians, quote, should be able to go about their work and campaign without harassment, intimidation, and abuse. Tim Farron, the leader of the pro-Europe Liberal Democrats, said, quote, I'm not laughing along with the attack on Farage. Violence and intimidation are wrong no matter who they're aimed at, end quote. The conversation surrounding the milkshake spring had framed the act of throwing a milkshake at a politician as political violence. But as Matt Ford writes in an article titled Why Milkshaking Works for the New Republic, quote, what these critiques misunderstand is why milkshaking is so potent against Farage and his brethren. It humiliates them. Nothing animates the far right or shapes its worldview quite so much as the desire to humiliate others, and the fear of being humiliated themselves. It's why alt-right trolls projecting their own sexual insecurities enjoy calling their opponents cucks. It's why they rally around blustery authoritarian figures like Donald Trump who cast themselves as beyond embarrassment, shame, or ridicule. They brandish humiliation like a weapon while craving release from it. Getting doused in a milkshake robs the far-right figures of the air of chauvinistic invulnerability that they spend so much time cultivating. They hunger to be taken seriously despite their racist views. They want to be described as dapper, to be interviewed on evening news broadcasts and weekend talk show panels, and to be seen as a legitimate participant in the democratic process. For those seeking mainstream legitimacy, it's another searing reminder that they do not belong. End quote. Milkshaking found its way to Portland, Oregon, where conservative figure Andy Ngo was sprayed with silly spring by anti-fascists before having a milkshake thrown at him. Portland police initially tweeted that they had received reports of a milkshake containing quick-drying cement, and although this claim was widely transmitted, no proof of these claims was ever presented, and now it's treated as a hoax. It's also worth noting something pointed out by Hassan Piker, that sugar, when mixed with concrete, prevents the concrete from solidifying. This is an old builder's trick often used to keep concrete from setting too fast on hot days, which would lead to cracking. And it was a technique used by French anarchists in the 1980s to try and stop prisons from being built. Now, the overreaction to milkshaking, the politicians in the UK calling it political violence, the Portland Police Bureau reporting quick-dry cement in the milkshakes, and the absurd debate of milkshaking ethics, all of it recalled a similar debate in the United States a couple years prior, which was, of course, the ethics of punching Nazis. This debate was sparked when American neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, and white supremacist Richard Spencer was sucker-punched after attending the inauguration of Donald Trump. Now, from a philosophical perspective, I mean, this isn't dicey at all. If you take up the question of whether it's morally correct to punch Nazis from a utilitarian or a consequentialist angle, punching a Nazi is an action that brings more happiness into the world, right? So like, in that punching a Nazi prevents Nazism. A lot of us might even be good with elevating the moral correctness of punching Nazis to a universal rule to be applied to all people at all times under all circumstances. I want to state clearly that I am one of those people who believes it is always morally correct to punch a Nazi. I believe a punch may be uncivil, but racism is worse. More than simply making genocidal views unwelcome, I believe that fascism isn't to be debated, because tabling the viewpoints of fascists lends legitimacy to their ideas, and no one should have to debate their right to exist. What would be the point in debating someone like Richard Spencer, who is known for his public advocacy of violence against non-whites, and has called for the reconstitution of the European Union into a white racial empire? What would that discussion sound like? I mean, what is to be done with a person whose supporters reportedly give him a sieg heil when he enters a room? Now, our interviewed guest today is Laura Jedeed, and she makes a very necessary distinction between the alt-right and what she calls the alt-light, which is, you know, those members of the far right who are not overtly ethno-nationalist. And this distinction is important because if it is morally correct to punch a Nazi, then we have to make sure the people we are making the object of our contempt are in fact Nazis. After all, it's probably not always morally correct to punch a casual racist or even the highly active racist, face down bravely by anti-fascists during protests. Even though I think we all understand that fighting racism isn't just the dismantling of racist laws, but it's also the dismantling of a social climate that breeds and accepts racist beliefs. I really wanted to speak to Laura about her work because she has spent a considerable amount of time as an observer within a far-right group called Patriot Prayer. And through her research, she's been able to document some of their recruitment methods. Laura writes about the far right on her website and on social media, but the thing that drew me to her work is that she is really attempting to understand, decode, and reach people at risk of falling for the far right worldview. Her brand of anti-fascism is invested in addressing the root of the cause, because she knows in order to stop fascism, that is what we'll need to do. So Laura, thanks for coming on the show. It's great to have you. Welcome to No Easy Answers.
Hi there, I'm Laura Jedeed. I'm a journalist with opinions. I write and make videos on the internet. My bylines include Salon, Truthout, Willamette Week, Portland Monthly Magazine, and I primarily focus on the far right.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a shit ton of stuff I want to talk to you about, specifically the far right. I have been really kind of intrigued by, or at least I've been really stewing on questions of like after January 6th, it's like I started to see these people as like not so much fascist to smash, but like maybe they were cult victims, maybe they're underneath some spell. And so this empathy muscle is kind of kicked in a little bit. And I have issues with that myself. Like I don't want to show these people too much empathy or be too charitable with them. But I read your article, How I Got Here, and there are so many things that resonated with me about it. And it's a wonderful article, by the way. And listeners, and for listeners, I mean, it's kind of a quick read, but it's really insightful. And like, you talk about like the Ayn Rand stuff, objectivist philosophy that you had as a kid and your journey to more radical politics. So I guess, I mean, if we can maybe start at the beginning, maybe we'll start with like objectivism for now, because, and I don't know if you would maybe be comfortable explaining what that is. And can you explain about like what objectivism is for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a well-known one. A short answer would be libertarianism on steroids. The longer answer would be it's people who attempt to live their lives based on Ayn Rand's philosophy as expressed in her fiction and nonfiction books. So if you've ever read Atlas Shrugged, imagine somebody trying to live that way all the time. Right.
I haven't actually read Atlas Shrugged. I'm more familiar with like Anthem by her, and there's this whole process of the pronoun I, or just I and the individual, was something that was gone away with and didn't exist, and these people slowly but surely discovered their individuality through it. And looking back on it, it was just kind of anti-collectivist propaganda in a lot of ways. So
yes, that's exact. I guess I should, rather than referencing other things, I could actually talk about that. That is at the core of it, absolutely, the idea of just really very extreme individualism. Any kind of collectivism is considered evil. Any kind of altruism is considered evil. Selfishness is considered a virtue. If you're not getting something out of it, it's bad. And any kind of sacrifice is looked down on. Now, according to like objectivism, that doesn't mean that you never do anything for other people. You just do it for your own selfish motives. So like, if I wanted to like bake a cookie and give it to you, and that gave me joy, that would be moral. But like, if I felt obligated to bake you a cookie, then that would be evil. So that's a thing.
Right. I was in reading your article, I think you had mentioned how your parents listened to like Rush Limbaugh or something like that. And I totally, like, as a kid, I had traces of Rush Limbaugh's shit going through my house as a child. And, and you listed some things you took from objectivism, affirmative action being evil and climate change being not real, and along with all these other things which are really like get to the core of what you're talking about with your economic prosperity is like equivalent to like moral goodness, and the lack thereof is like something that is seen as like a moral failure almost. So yeah, there's stuff about that that's really been resonating with me, because I've started to think of, like lately I've started to think of capitalism as a cult, in that the dollar bill sort of became secularized in like a way that really comports with objectivism, that like this dollar is representative of hard work or something, and grants you access to certain privilege, and more how like the United States has taken on like structural properties of organized religion with like sacred documents and the monuments around DC, and the renewal process of like Memorial Day. So when I was reading your article about objectivism, part of me felt like that kind of went in hand with a bit of maybe evangelical religion, Christianity to a certain degree. But I think you tried to draw a distinction in there between evangelical Christian beliefs and things like that and objectivism.
Yeah. That's also, I think, a very interesting part of what Ayn Rand's influence has been. The hardcore objectivists, it's a very small group. They fracture about every 6 months, and they are militant atheists. Rand was an atheist.
Yeah.
But wow. Ayn Rand's books have had a much wider influence than that. I mean, it's one of the more cohesive, coherent philosophies of the right. The right doesn't have a lot of philosophers. So you do get a lot of evangelicals who admire Rand's books a great deal. They don't like the atheist part, and they don't like some other parts, but they very much like the doctrine of selfishness and this idea that money making is good actually and very moral. It gels really well with the Protestant work ethic in a way I think that would very much upset Miss Rand if it was pointed out to her, if it had been.
Right. So this gets to like some of the because we're talking about the alt-right, and we're talking about people who are perhaps susceptible to recruitment measures of the alt-right. And so how this all relates to this is that there is, and like you said, the right doesn't have too many philosophers. I mean, unless they're misinterpreting parts of Nietzsche, or they're maybe quoting like Heidegger or some shit, you know. So I wonder, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that at the core of fascism, maybe I've begun kind of equating this into like saying not so much fascism, but like the logic of fascism.
Yes.
And so I think objectivism, the things you mentioned, I think that comports nicely with the logic of fascism. So I wonder if this like sort of informs you as you go through your work.
Yeah, it's something I'm really hoping to work on more this year, is the more often, you know, the libertarian to alt-right pipeline is what they talk about, because there are more libertarians than objectivists, but it is not immediately intuitive why a system of belief that is so rooted in individuality would lend itself so well to one of the most collectivist systems ever devised by man. I mean, fascism is very much about subverting the individual to the state or the leader. And it's weird that it meshes so well. I think, and I feel like there's a lot more to this that I haven't really explored. But the thing that pops out to me is that I think that individualism and capitalism leads to the kind of isolation and loneliness that Hannah Arendt talks about this a lot. Like, this feeling of just alienation and disconnectedness is what makes fascism so appealing. So I think that people who really subscribe to these hyper-individualist worldviews they're hungry for some kind of togetherness and belonging. And when something comes along that offers that, but it's cloaked in the ideas like, you know, this idea of freedom, democracy, free speech, like these words that mean a lot to conservatives, they're very susceptible to being like, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for.
Right. And like the restoration of community, obviously right now is even more effective in our COVID isolation, right? But I mean, this is the need for community is something that I even pick up on whenever I talk to apostates. You know, they're like, hey man, you know, I don't miss the sermons, I don't miss like the bake sales, I don't miss tithing. What they miss is like community, and they don't find that source of community something that's easily replaced in the world. And so it almost like there's like this residual, irreducible loneliness to being an apostate, in that you had this community, you don't have that community now, you can't restore or, you know, replace that community easily. And so you never quite feel in place after that. So anyway, so yeah, I've been stewing on this shit for a second and thinking about thinking about ways that like QAnon is a cult, thinking of ways that the recruitment measures of certain alt-right groups could be similar to the tactics used by cults as well, in that they maybe positive reinforcement, insular communities, discouraging you from speaking to people outside the group, cult of personality. There's all these different characteristics that that kind of make the cult community sort of align with the recruitment ways of QAnon, of white supremacist groups, what have you, right? And obviously, community plays a large part of that. But I've really started to examine these people as members of a cult rather than just fascists to be smashed, right? And so your work is really intriguing to me in that, like, I think that you are at least attempting to decode or understand or unravel why people fall in these groups. Maybe you could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm very passionate about that. Actually, I do believe in community defense. I think that if somebody poses a danger to the community, then you have to meet that with defensive action up to and including violence. But I don't think that solves the root problem, because I sometimes say that your fascism or fascist logic is a bad solution to real problems. And I would agree that the people who fall into this are actually victims. That does not mean that they are innocent. It does not absolve them of their actions. But I think it's a useful approach, because the real goal should be to not have to smash any fascists ever again, that there just aren't any. And it's my hope that by understanding why people fall into us, we can maybe understand better how to pull them out of this. The thing you said about community earlier is very interesting and important, because a lot of people attack fascist thought on an ideological level, and that's not what draws people in my experience or in my research. It is a lot that sense of community. That's a big thing, and you can't logic someone out of that. You can't logic someone out of a cult.
Right. Yeah. So here's, I want to know what you think about this too, because the more I thought about this, the more I thought that maybe appealing to these people across class lines or for a shared class interest, or even trying to address their concerns from a political or a legislative angle, right? Like, I don't think these people are fucking like social democrats in waiting. Like, I don't think that, like, if we forgave their student loans and we gave them a higher minimum wage and did things to objectively make their lives better, to make better their material conditions, I don't think that they're responsive to those things or would be responsive to those things, because their projects aren't political. Their projects are like spiritual and cultural. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a very important point. Like, we have a laboratory, we have Europe, where things are not perfect, but they're a lot better than here. We have, they have socialized medicine, they have more robust welfare programs, and the far right is ascendant there as well. And that to me indicates exactly what you're talking about. This is a spiritual crisis. This is a crisis, I think, caused by capitalism. And social democracy can mitigate a lot of the pain of capitalism on a material level, but it doesn't resolve the spiritual crisis. And so you're always going to have this reaction, I think.
When you say spiritual crisis, I mean, it's interesting. I think that there are people like Steve Bannon and Alexander Dugin, who are like big T traditionalists, that are single-handedly almost reviving names like Julius Evola or Rene Guénon. And there's like an overlap there. And what I mean by that is, like Steve Bannon was in the Navy, and he used to know in any port where he stopped, he knew where like the metaphysical bookstore was in that town. Right.
Wow.
So yeah. So like Steve is totally into this shit. He's into this white nationalist alt-right art toast publishing shit. Like he's read a ton of these authors. But I thought it was really funny that like Marianne Williamson used to own a metaphysical bookstore in Houston, Texas. Right. So where I'm going with this is that I think there is this like individualistic sort of like liberals these days tend to like be religious syncretists, where they take the yoga out of the Hindu tradition, they take the praying out of the Abrahamic religion, and they make this kind of ultra personalized type of religion. this sort of religion of the heart almost, right? But they're the same people who are like, that would find the things that Marianne Williamson says about kind of channeling love from your heart and all that stuff. Like that appeals to these people, and so this sort of metaphysical, weird, individual alchemy sort of religion that is espoused by modern liberals has some overlap with these like big T traditionalists in a way, that it's really more about feeling, not about rationality, but how you feel. And so when you say a spiritual crisis, and I don't really know where I'm going with this other than to say that like, there is some overlap between fascism and traditionalism through people like Alexander Dugin and Steve Bannon. But there's also some overlap in like kind of in modernity that we see through the other side of the political aisle through people like Marianne Williamson, who are more feelingless, thinking, channeling love, all that stuff.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of all the people you just named are trying to address the crisis with limited, I think, success. I'm an unabashed Marianne Williamson fan. I don't agree with her a lot of the time. She's written some real bad stuff about weight, but she is one of the only people on the left who's really attempting to address this. I think it's hard to know what to do with it. I think you've kind of nailed it. Like a lot of it is very individualistic. It doesn't actually heal that wound. I don't have any answers there. I really wish I did. I think about it a lot, but I do actually think it's a good sign that there are some people on the left who are at least thinking about it in those terms, even if they are not there as far as like a real solution. Like people are really starting to, I think, see that the problem goes beyond material objects, which are also important. You've also got to eat, but even the people who are eating aren't feeling great. And I hope that we continue to explore those routes and we don't do the things that we do a lot on the left where we just surrender ground to the right because they've taken it. Like, there's been some things like that where we've just surrendered the idea that there are pedophiles in power because QAnon says so. But like we have Epstein's flight logs, like we know that's real, but we've just ceded it to the far right. And we got to not do that with this. This is the most important thing, I think, to hold on to.
Right. Yeah. I think that, and I wonder because there's so much out there that seems innocuous at first, and then it's like, oh, what do you know? It was like cloaked in fascism, right? Like even things like Jordan Peterson or something, where at first you think a comparison of lobsters is some psychologist is mentioning this stuff, and it's a self-help book. Maybe we didn't see it any different than like Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now or something. But over time, we've seen that there are specific types of people who cling to his subject matter and end up with the logic of fascism, right? And so do you think there's like an archetype for the type of person who would be, a candidate or susceptible to the logic of fascism or these far-right groups in their recruitment measures?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, and I'm going a little bit off of what I know for sure. I could talk a lot about what attracts people to groups like Patriot Prayer and the alt-right, which is people who aren't overtly ethno-nationalist. I do think that people who are attracted to things like Jordan Peterson or Sargon of Akkad or anyone like that tend to be people looking for answers of some sort. Like these are, you don't end up on a Jordan Peterson video because your life is going well. You end up on a Jordan Peterson video because he seems to have answers and like you're looking for that, like things are not going well for you. And it doesn't mean that you're impoverished. Like a lot of the knee-jerk reaction to that is like, pointing to the statistics that say like a lot of Trump voters are above median income. But that doesn't mean they're happy. Like capitalism's bad for everyone, all right? Like, so it's not surprising that people who are wealthier are feeling like their life is out of control and looking for someone to tell them to clean their room. I can tell you on the alt-right that what I found was a lot of people who are willing to go out in the street and brawl tend to be blue collar. They tend to not be college educated. They tend to not be particularly political, actually. They don't. Right. When the people I interviewed did not have strong political beliefs in like any kind of philosophical or ideological or theoretical sense. And they all tend to be very, very concerned about the left as an enemy. Like, I think that might also be something that's more broadly applicable, is this idea that there's an enemy that is attempting to destroy America, both within and without, which is classic fascist thinking. And once you nail down the enemy, it's a pretty smooth slope to wherever bad place you want to go.
Right, right. And I mean, this gets to, I mean, there were like 3 or 4 lines in your article that made me stop and really like just check in and resonate and be like, wow, that's really powerful what you said. And one of them was like the thing about bootstraps that you said about how they're very attractive to someone who's doing well already. But if you happen to like fail with bootstraps, then you're not only like a failure, but you're morally like a failure, and you're disgusting, and your sense of inner goodness can really be jeopardized through that. And so I guess what I'm saying is that these people have to sort of, they only have limited options, as you said, once they hit rock bottom, right? I mean, you have to either reevaluate everything, or you can off yourself, or you can uh, start looking for enemies and start looking for someone to blame. And I think that's that reoccurring mechanism we're speaking to, in that the right oftentimes will develop an enemy out of the left somehow, and that fuels so many other things that they are able to do at that point. So yeah, it's a classic thing of fascism, right? I mean, in order for fascism to exist as capitalism and decay, for it to do its thing, it's got to have an enemy. So it's like, more broadly, you can kind of point this out on the macro level with like the United States always having a big enemy. Whereas the microcosm is just like the alt-right and just pointing at liberals or being anti-Semitic or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's baked into, like you said, it's baked into America in a way that leaves us very susceptible to fascism, I think, as a country. We, like you said, we've always had one. At least we've certainly had one since, I mean, I guess you could argue back to World War I, definitely since World War II. And we had a brief period in the 90s where we didn't have one, and it was weirdly unmooring. And I mean, September 11th is something that I can remember, and for sure it was horrible and everyone was extremely upset. But I feel like there was also this almost a feeling of coming back to normal. Like, oh God, you know, they're finally a great struggle, something to give us meaning, which is incredibly just the logic of America is very fascist in this way, I think.
Holy shit. Yeah, I mean, I mean, so many people that I know that are around my age. I mean, I'm 37 at this point, and I've just never known a time when we weren't at war. And it, just like, so we've never known a time that we weren't at war, and then our militarism, like in our police force, is in so many ways is just our militarism that we've exported, washing upon our shores, coming home. You know, so like the military that we export comes back home to our schools and the school police and our communities and the police, and they're militarized now. And so the need for this enemy has definitely, like, I mean, it's caused more, the ripple effects are just, we could go on forever about that. But I guess the enemy and the geopolitical aspect of all this stuff, man, down to the individual, within Patriot Prayer or within QAnon or what have you, it just seems like the more this goes on, the more comical it gets as well. Like the more outlandish these enemies could be. You know, like it's even moderate Democrats are called communist. Even the further you get to the right, the more outlandish the caricatures of liberals and the left become. So I guess, you know, in terms of the creation of the enemy and things, it really comes back to just fascism on the individual level, fascism on the macro level. When I spoke to the culty programmer guy, he basically just told me that, like, the way that he deprograms people, he basically just shows them the recruitment methods and the tricks that led someone to falling for these things. Would you say that maybe your process of attempting to de-radicalize people would be similar to that?
That makes a lot of sense. And I will say, I mean, I'm not an expert on de-radicalization. A lot of my work is focused on understanding, with a hope that someday I would get there. But that makes complete sense, because there is a very specific way that people are recruited into this, and very specific way, things that appeal to people. Like my research in college revolves a lot around the way that videos of protests are used to convince people that the left is the enemy, and to convince them to come out in the street or to vote in a certain way. Something, though, that I've read and that seems to be true, going kind of back to the community thing, is that an important part of getting people even to the point where they're ready to be deprogrammed at all is what James Aho is a sociologist, and he calls it the push-pull method. That might not be from him directly, but it's where I read it, which is that in order to get someone out of a cult or something like a cult, there has to be a push, which is that the cult is no longer fulfilling whatever need they entered the cult for, and a pull where somebody outside is offering that thing. So like you've got a case like Derek Black, who is the son of, I believe, the founder of Stormfront. I might be getting that wrong. A very prominent neo-Nazi's son who was pulled out of that kind of radicalism by somebody he met in college who was Jewish, who invited him for Shabbat dinner repeatedly, which is an incredible thing to do. I don't think everyone should feel like they need to do that, but it was actually effective. Like, he was in college, he wasn't surrounded by his community, he had a push, and then there was a pull of somebody saying, hey, you can get out of this. And that's where I feel like some of the all the fash rhetoric is very harmful. Again, I'm all for community defense. That's really important. But when you give people who are engaged in alt-right or any kind of extremist ideology the message that you will never be okay and that you will never be forgiven and you will never be accepted into society, oh my God, this is the opposite of a pull. You're pushing them right back in.
Yeah. You know, there's also some people would argue that like a more robust people's movement would be inclusive of these folks who we can reach along class lines, shared class interests and stuff. And yeah, like I want to think that there is a possibility for like late life conversions, you know, like that there is some sort of redemption available or some path out of that, and that people are redeemable, like that Michael Brooks quote is like, be ruthless with systems, but be kind to people, kind of thing.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I've kind of, that's repeated in my head at times like a mantra through this, because it's a strange thing to go from the type of anti-fascist work of being out in protest and maybe being a bit of muscle to having a bit of empathy that you don't really want to show or have, but then you're like, wait a second here, like maybe there's too many of them. Maybe their influence in society needs to be addressed, and part of that is addressing the root of why these people are where they're at. But one thing I wonder in your research, because you were kind of embedded as engaging in a sort of like immoral ethnography, if you will, like not like hanging out with people as an ethnographer that you like, but hanging out with people that you don't like, which has its own gray area and questions and stuff, right? But I wonder if there's any sort of exit costs. And what I mean by that is like with people who are going to leave the group, they're going to lose a few things. And so I wonder if there's like a significant exit cost for some members of these groups, and maybe you could speak to that a little. Yeah.
No, I think so. And to actually, I want to talk about something that you just said about the uncomfortableness of having empathy for these people, because I think a lot of people feel that, and I think it's a correct reaction, because in order to empathize with these people, you have to understand why fascist thought is appealing to them, and that's very scary because it is appealing. And if you let yourself feel that, there's this idea that you might fall into the abyss yourself, and there's a natural abhorrence of that idea. And I think sometimes people take that very healthy abhorrence and then determine from that it's not worth doing, and anyone who does do it is suspicious. But I think it's kind of the only way to get to the bottom of it and to understand that there is this pull. I think the two exit costs that would come to mind for me in my experience would be, one, the loss of community, which we've already discussed, right, but also a loss of purpose. Like, especially for people on the street, these are people who, usually either, maybe they work a 9 to 5, maybe they're underemployed, but like their lives usually aren't going great. Like, you know what I mean? They don't have a ton, but going out on weekends and brawling gives them this feeling that they're part of something bigger than themselves. One of the people I interviewed for my thesis was somebody who'd been in the military and started listening to Alex Jones as he was being processed out of the military for medical reasons. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he moved from fighting the global war on terrorism to fighting the globalist demons or whatever, Right. It's hard because you've got to replace that sense of purpose with something else. And like I said, our society doesn't, the spiritual crisis means that we don't have a lot of purpose to offer people. We have boring lives and cubicles to offer people. And it's honestly a lot more fun to feel like you're battling the forces of darkness.
Right. I also feel like there's a certain like defensive positioning towards their hierarchical positioning. Like there is, on the one hand, yes, their life may not be going that well. They, are looking for something to belong to, a greater movement that's bigger than themselves. But there's also people showing up at the Capitol in like 2019 Dodge Rams, 2020 fucking trucks, and it's petty bouge all day, and like the people standing on the Capitol at Michigan are holding like $5,000 rifles, and that's not a weapon of the proletariat. That's like that's a very expensive weapon that most people aren't going to be able to afford. And who the fuck is able to take off work in the middle of a Wednesday during a pandemic, fly to DC, stay in Trump's hotel? It's like this sort of thing. There's both sides of it, and I'm just very hesitant to try to be inclusive on an organizational level with folks like this. Obviously, I mean, you mentioned the community defense thing, like I'm not eager to invite these people into any movement. I do want to like discover why they fell into certain or like what appealed to them that hooked them within fascism, whether that's community or purpose or what have you. How prevalent is like conspiratorial thinking amongst these groups?
Oh, universal. That's a universal thing. And it's actually, I mean, it's almost ubiquitous in America as well. I forget this, whether it's a third or half of everyone in America believes in at least one conspiracy theory. It's some outrageous number. And it's certainly very concentrated on the far right. It's the closed logic of conspiratorial thinking lends itself, I think, very well to fascism, which is where like an open logic thing would be like, I believe that it's going to rain tomorrow, and then it doesn't rain tomorrow. And I'm like, okay, this new information has changed my view on the facts. But in conspiratorial logic, you're like, the globalists are controlling everything. And if you're like, no, that's not true, here's some evidence, that's just evidence of how hard the globalists control everything. Like they're able to manufacture this evidence to like look like they aren't. Like there's no way to disprove it. And oh my Lord, I mean, that's the whole thing, I think, on the far right. Like the linchpin that holds it together is this closed loop where you can't get out. I feel like there's got to be some cult influences there too. That I don't know a lot about cults proper, but like that feels real culty to me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I understand the closed logic thing, and that makes total sense. And I guess it was kind of an obvious question to ask you about the conspiratorial thing, because clearly, like, I mean, I think all these sort of connected streams connect into one body of water, which is like anti-Semitism, basically. Like it all connects.
Go deep enough in any conspiracy, and that's where you'll get to eventually.
That's where you get to eventually, yeah. And so, but I also think that like, and this is something else we can talk about, is that like, we live in a very tarnished history of like true conspiracies, so for every conspiratorial thinker out there that is pointing to like chemtrails and pointing to like the Illuminati and shit like that, there's somebody else out there that's like, hey, the FBI killed Fred Hampton, and they just released new evidence about Malcolm X's assassination, which is all true, and the Gulf of Tonkin, that never happened, and so we have even like weapons of mass destruction and the things that were said about Saddam Hussein with like the human shredder and the Naraya testimony. And anyway, so there's all these things in history that were lied to us, that we know that we were lied to. And so this really muddies the water of like conspiratorial thinkers and people who are just familiar with history in a way.
That's a really, really powerful point. Yeah, it is. I mean, for God's sake, MK Ultra, like that sounds as probably more absurd than a lot of Q stuff. Like the idea that the CIA was using psychedelic drugs to try to like brainwash, like what the fuck? Like it's true and hard to do. I do think that brings up another side of it, which is something I kind of mentioned earlier, like the thing where we've like, for example, seeded the pedophilic cabal of elites to the right, where like, again, we have Epstein's flight logs. That shit is real. But we get into this oppositional thinking where we're like, no, Q is a bunch of crazy people. Like everything they say is wrong. And it's like, there's another way. You could actually be like, no, look, like you're right. Like a lot of people seem to have been on those planes, but like that doesn't mean Q is real. Can we talk about this in another way? Right. It is hard to like navigate between conspiratorial thinking and oppositional thinking and like keeping an open mind while also dismissing crazy stuff. It's hard. It really is hard to navigate the truth. I think part of the appeal of conspiratorial thinking is that it offers a way to just have truth. without having to navigate the absolute shit show that is our history and our current situation.
Right. And you know, like if you mentioned Hannah Arendt earlier, and so I think about her, like the banality of evil, in that the explanations for human suffering are much more banal and boring than sensationalist conspiracy theories would have us believe. You know, so like you could blame I don't know, like you could blame China and the Wuhan Institute of Virology and go down conspiracy paths towards explaining away the coronavirus, or you know, it's a naturally occurring disease, you know, and so we have these places like germ theory, which are much more sound areas to be informed from, but inevitably you get this conspiracy theorist that ends up like holding a cell phone and pointing to an article that says, see, there's a microchip to track you inside the vaccine, which it's, you know, you're holding a cell phone and they're already tracking you, and if they wanted to, you know.
Yeah, we're all tracked. It's fine.
Yeah. So I wonder, I mean, it goes towards the need to explain the world away, and maybe the attraction of conspiracy theories is an easy explanation. And I wonder if I mean, obviously, I think that plays into fascism too, in a way. Like any conspiracy theory in the tarnished history, that really plays into the effectualness of fascist logic and fascist thought, fascist recruitment. Because at the end of the day, that makes it easier to point towards an enemy or to explain away, and so that to me is really concerning, because none of this works without an enemy. You know?
Yeah, it is. And it's especially because enemies abound, and it's hard to, in a society that's very isolated and alienated, we don't have a lot of other ways to generate community other than a common enemy. And I think you saw this on the left, the liberals and the leftists coming together to oppose Trump. Not everyone, but a lot of people, this idea that you have to vote for Biden or you're supporting Trump. And it brought people together. It got Biden elected. The same kind of like enemy logic is what got Trump out of office. And it comes back to this thing where we're just so alone that it's hard to generate community any other way.
Right. The title of your thesis, the Making Monsters, I have it here somewhere. Making Monsters, the like the far right's making of the liberal enemy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I paraphrased that wrong.
No, that's basically it. Yeah.
But, so if I'm understanding it correctly, it was about like the recruitment methods of Patriot Prayer. But were you writing about in your thesis? Were you writing about actually like how these enemies are manufactured as well, or is that? Yeah.
That was, the focus was on Patriot Prayer. The ethnography was of Patriot Prayer over about a year and a half, but the focus of the research was about how Patriot Prayer and groups like them create recruitment tools and change the narrative. The original question, this is a bit of a jumbled answer, but the original question was, why do these rallies exist? Like, why is this happening? Why are people coming into Portland and like giving speeches and spending their beautiful Saturdays, like standing around with American flags and occasionally punching people? And the answer that I found was that it's recruitment. There's a cycle of recruitment where you generate protest violence through a variety of means. You ensure that it will happen, which we can explore if you want to.
Sure.
And then you make videos of the protest violence, and then you edit them to tell a very simplified story, which I call fables in the thesis, like these like kind of archetypal characters, good versus evil, eliminating a lot of the subtleties of the whole situation, and then you put them on the internet so that people can watch them. And most people that watch them are just going to be like, oh, the left is in fact the enemy. Like, look at this video that shows video doesn't lie, which is the most stupid thing anyone's ever said. The idea that video doesn't lie. The cameraman is pointing the video. He's like, if somebody grabbed your head and swiveled it from left to right and said, this is real, this is real. Like, no. That's video. That's literally what a video is. Sorry, I'm very passionate about this. Like, it makes me so mad. Videos lie all the time. And videos lie to people in ways that make them think that the left is this demonic force, like just out to just irrationally scream at people. And most people will watch it and be like, I should vote for Trump. And then some people will watch it and be like, maybe I should fly to DC and storm the Capitol. I don't know. Why not?
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, it's just wild that like they kind of, create this whole propaganda campaign out of videos from violence that they start, and it's just like this self-feedback loop kind of thing that is created out of that. And so, I that's really wild to me, and I wasn't aware that was kind of. I mean, maybe I should have been aware of that, but I wasn't really aware
it's a
that.
200-page nightmare of an academic writing. No one should read it, honestly.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I haven't. I still need to read. Max sent me his thesis to Max Alvarez, and I haven't read that yet too. So I'm over 2 on these things at this point. Yeah. So all right. So there's this this sort of we have this European laboratory with the alt-right happening over there, right? And then we have this resurgence of fascism within the United States that's kind of created these subgroups in the United States that are creating videos that are misrepresenting them. Can you tell us about some of the events you've covered in Portland? That's a whole other area I wanted to ask you about, because I know you're from Portland, or you live there now, and you have covered a whole lot of events out there. And I think listeners will be really interested to know some of the stuff that you've seen out there.
Are you talking about the George Floyd protest of the summer, or the far right events that I've been to?
Well, let's start with the summer and go into the far right events.
Cool. Yeah, so I was honored to be here in Portland for this entire just absolutely mad summer. I started going to the protests as an activist. My first day was May 28th. And around the time that journalists started to get messed up in mid to mid-June, I decided to pivot to using some of my writing skills to try to convey the truth of that. And that was certainly just wild. It ties in, I think, to the far right in that the logic of police brutality, I feel like I don't know if I'm prepared to draw any kind of coherent parallel, but there's certainly parallels there. And seeing the way that a state can attempt to repress freedom of speech or enforce hierarchies that exist, the absolute violence behind the curtain that we usually don't see, the soft control where we go through life not feeling like we live in a police state, but challenge the police state and you'll fucking find out. Almost immediately, you will realize what you live in. And that has radicalized me. I mean, I considered myself a leftist before this summer. Oh boy, am I a leftist now.
Shit, man. Yeah, it's like the state can only control things via violence, and the only response to nonviolent protests was just additional violence. It was just a powder keg all summer out there. And I was watching the live streams anytime I could throughout the summer. Can you tell us about what was it? Tell me about this fucking gray zone of this ethnography you did, man. Because that's got to be ethically weird and murky, and so if you could speak to that, yeah.
I mean, I think it was. This is something that my thesis advisor was aware of, and but yeah, it is. It's a little bit gray area to go in, and what I tried to do was tell things that were true, but not the whole story. Which this is a kind of a scummy little technicality to get out of fooling people. But if for whatever reason, that's a logic that works for Reed College, where I would be a lot of people in the department hate this thesis because I'm trying to talk about you guys, which was absolutely true. There was a whole faction of the political science department that was like, what the fuck, do not. So that was true, talking about how I am concerned with free speech issues, because that is true. I am concerned with free speech. It's why I did what I did this summer. Talking about how I don't think they're all Nazis. That's definitely true. I don't think they're all the alt-right. I think that a lot of them help the alt-right. I think a lot of them have ideas that lend themselves to fascism, but I don't think they're all Nazis. So I was able to say that with honesty. And my compassion for these people was real, which has upset some people on the left today, that I feel like these are people who are spending their Saturdays trying to change the world. Now, I think that the way they're trying to change the world is real bad, but I weirdly have more respect for that than somebody that stays home and maybe has in America, we are all blah, blah, blah sign on their front lawn,
Right. Yeah. I mean, these people are up and out and they're wanting to take part in a movement. And I wonder, to the degree like, to what degree are they willing to ask themselves uncomfortable questions about what they believe, what actions they're willing to take? Because the typical American notions of like even freedom are very like negative notions. It's like freedom from,
Yeah.
it's not freedom to. And so it's like, don't tread on me, not like the freedom not to be. It's that's a negative connotation.
That's such a good point. Oh my God. Yeah.
So I've been thinking about the concept of freedom quite a bit lately, and I'm a musician / songwriter that turned into a podcaster because it was just too ethically complicated to like continue performing when COVID hit, right? So I started this podcast and I started thinking of things, and as I've been trying to write lyrics around thinking about the concept of freedom, that I don't normally quote lyrics during this show, but the lyrics are like, what does freedom mean to you? Does it mean you spread your wings, or does it mean you lose your chains? Because these things are not the same.
Ooh. Yeah.
Yeah. So for the petty bouge, man, they're out there, they're just trying to spread their wings, right? They're not trying to lose chains. Even if you are privileged, you still feel oppressed, and you're still thinking that you are fighting oppression. So for anyone who is like liberation minded, we have to see that these folks they may be misinformed, they may be profoundly wrong, their actions may be terrible, but maybe underneath that shell somewhere, they're still acting from a place that is trying to preserve a sense of freedom or trying to limit a perceived oppression.
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. And I also think, I agree that objectively speaking, the petty bouge are not oppressed compared to basically any other group that you could point to. But I do think that there are chains on them, and I'm not asking anyone to like shed tears for the middle class here, but I think it's important to like. I don't know how many listeners have worked a white collar job in a cubicle where you do spreadsheets all day. And those are some fucking chains. Like, that is a miserable, shitty way to live. And I would choose that life over, abject poverty or a houseless condition any day. But that's real sadness. Like, that's real shittiness. And like, this is the thing where it's very tempting. And I understand why people will dismiss people who are like, oh, I'm so oppressed, when like there's somebody like right down the street who's like a person of color or a Black person getting shot by the police, or any number of things you could point to. But like, I think the more productive thing is to go, no, your life does suck. Have you considered that it might be capitalism? Like, that might be why you're so unhappy. Like, look at you. Like, you have all this stuff. I have a lot of friends that have like, large houses and good savings accounts, and they're cruising towards retirement, and they're fucking miserable. Every single one of them is unhappy. Mm-hmm. Like, this system it makes us miserable. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing here is people who want to lose the chains of that, and ironically are seeking out larger, heavier chains in the process.
Yeah, it's like, here, these chains not heavy enough for you. Here, why don't you wear these instead? Yeah, here's an anvil. So yeah, I just I look at this shit, man, and I wonder about all this, and I worked in a nursing home for a little bit, and I'll tell you that like there are people with I think this old man, he would sit in his really dark room and watch television, and you could never, like, he didn't seem to be engaged in the same reality that I was in, right? Because it's like, it's snowing outside, and there's like, it's February, and I walk in there, and the Animal Planet is on. I'm like, how you doing? He's like, go away, I'm watching the Yankees. And I'm like, so it's like, I say all this because like, before I decided to be like, oh yeah, who's winning? As a response, I had to ask myself, like, hey, man, is it healthy for me to like engage in what you think is reality? Like, is it healthy for me to either A, engage with you, or is it B, detrimental to you if I try to extract you from that reality too? So for someone who's like really into Jordan Peterson, or someone who's a member of Patriot Prayer or whatever, even presenting the concept of the enemy being something else, this strikes to the core of their belief system. And I think there's even a real danger in pointing that out.
Yeah, no, I agree. Because you're not just challenging their ideas, you're challenging their identity, like their idea of who they are as a person. which is something that I alluded to in the thing I wrote about my own transformation, is this, it's a deconstruction of self. And for me, it took a really catastrophic tragedy to make me do it. Like, I don't think I ever would have if I hadn't had to just remake myself for survival. And I don't think that's not really a model that I would advocate for as a praxis exactly. And it's hard to know how to do that. But I think, like, I hope maybe in 5 years someone else has a better answer than the one I'm about to give. Like, hopefully somebody can figure it out. But like, I feel like all you can do is just kind of lob things over the fence, just like planting seeds and hoping maybe, someday. Like, I mean, a lot of my stuff was that way. Like, a lot of my work around the racist ideas that I think we're all indoctrinated in and that I certainly grew up with was like,
right,
people just kind of going, hey, that seems fucked up. And I'd be like, no, it's fine. I'm fine. I'm not racist. And like, what if maybe a little bit, and like, it took years. And then eventually I had a conversation where it all kind of came together. And I was like, oh, no, oh God, no, I got some issues here. I should probably think about this. Like, you might not see the results ever of these things, but I do think that, like, just kind of being like, hey, you don't have to be like this, or this doesn't seem like freedom to me, or like, in what way is punching someone free speech? That sort of thing. Like,
right,
just, and you can't beat yourself up for not succeeding, because you mostly won't, as far as I can tell.
Right.
All you can do is kind of try. And I also think not everyone needs to try. And this is just a thing I've been thinking about a lot. I'm just going to take the opportunity to talk about it. Like, It's okay if you're listening to this and you're like, I would never want to do that. That sounds horrible. Cool. Don't do it. I think people that have been who have been oppressed or beaten up or like otherwise hurt by the far right should not re-traumatize themselves by doing this work. But I also think they shouldn't stand in the way of people who want to do this work. I think that there's a diversity of tactics that's very important.
Totally agree with you there. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, and if you've observed any of this yourself, and maybe you could, maybe we could unpack some of the reasons why we think this is now. But there's this new kind of term that I've found floating around called multicultural whiteness, and to me that kind of pops up with like someone like Enrique Tarrio, who's like clearly not white, but he's part of the Proud Boys, right? He said to be one of his leaders, right? And so I wonder, and why I find this so threatening or concerning, rather, is that I know what radicalized me, or what pushed me in that position, like what pushed me towards seeking out more radical politics, or even like learning politics in fucking general, man, was like when I saw Trump say the thing about Mexicans, rapists, and like that. I was, okay, so I'm half Mexican. I was sitting at home with my mother, and I don't get to see her very often, and she's Mexican, and my whole family's Mexican, but they have a bit of this like multicultural whiteness, in that I've told my mom before, I've been like, Mom, I think you think you're white, but you're not, because, whiteness is a thing that can be revoked without any notification, So anyway, so it took that threat to people that I cared about in order for me to have this sort of empathy of like, oh shit, now there's a threat to me and mine, and now I have to. So I was radicalized out of that threat, I think, So why this Enrique Tarrio thing concerns me is because that guy is clearly not white, and clearly there are threats to he and his through this group in a way, like people that share his skin color, but apparently he's just fucking impervious to it, and that is really scary to me.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I mean, you go on any of the Proud Boy telegrams and they can say whatever they want about being a non-racist drinking fraternity and just liking Western tradition. But like, I promise you, every one out of every 5 messages is at least anti-Semitic. And it's just, it's an absolute lie. I do. And again, like, this is something more, it might be me projecting, but I don't think so. There's the idea of being one of the good ones is, I think, very powerful for people. Like, one way to react to oppression is to try to stop it. And another way to react to it is to rationalize it. Because the idea that you're like, you started out behind the starting line and that people just hate you for who you are, that's fucking terrible. Like, that's a real depressing thing to believe. And it's maybe easier to believe that, like, no, like, they don't hate me because my skin color, they hate me because people who look like me tend to be degenerate, but not me. I'm one of the good ones. A story I've told on Twitter is of myself. I am a woman, and I was in the military, and the military is a very misogynistic place. And there was a training course I was doing where I walked in after lunch, and I was one of two women in the class, and the other one wasn't there, and everyone was telling misogynistic jokes. And this went on for a bit. And then I said, I have a joke. And everyone turned to me and they were just, oh no, because even then, I could have reported them and nothing would have happened, but I could have,
Sure. Yeah.
And then I told a misogynistic joke that was worse than all of theirs. And I've never gotten a bigger laugh in my entire life. And I've never felt better about a joke in the moment that I did then, because I was one of them. I was one of the good ones. We weren't talking about me, that was just, weak women that's not me, but of course it's me. But that temptation, I think, is why people like Enrique Tarrio, feeling like you've transcended whatever, just individually instead of communally.
It comes back to the community thing we're talking about, right? Because part of the reason why you felt good about that joke is because you were now part of that community as one of them, accepted and revered. And this, in terms of the multicultural whiteness thing, I think there's a really powerful sense of white proximity there. But I also think there's a bit of a Fanonian sort of psychology happening, the colonized seeking to be more like the colonizer, seeking to be through white proximity, assimilating to the max that they can be, relegating potential to how white can they be, So stuff like that is really to see. It's one thing to see a roaming gang of dudes in Philly who are all just white and Italian with some bats or looking to beat up Antifa. That's one thing. But to see maybe a multi ethnic core or multi sort of to have someone like Enrique Tarrio fronting your shit is. It's really quite concerning, but I think it also community, white proximity, Fanonian stuff. So I guess I sensed a little bit of and I don't want to get too far into this if I'm stepping on your toes or what have you, but being a biracial person, I resonated with what you said about your father and then when 9/11 happened, kind of, being discouraged from seeking out things about your Syrian roots or that part of you that's Syrian. And so, but that resonated with me too. And that's why I bring up the Fanonian thing, because as a kid, I was discouraged from learning Spanish. I was told that I was a cowboy, not a vaquero sort of thing. I grew up in Texas, So there is this sort of get white as you can, as fast as you can sort of thing. And then there was the other side of it, which is so if they're teaching you to reject that side of you, then they're also teaching you to embrace the objectivist parts, the whiteness. And that's kind of what was done to me as well. That was embrace the bootstraps. You can be whatever you want as long as you work hard. So how much does that inform you when you're attempting to understand or decode the alt-right, coming from a past of someone telling you to reject parts of you, telling you to over-embrace other parts of you? Does that serve to inform you at all as you go through this?
That's such an interesting question. I'd never really thought about that. I don't think this is. First of all, I relate to everything you just said really very, very strongly. I think if anything, there's a kind of outsideness to being biracial, especially white passing, which I definitely am, where one's status is always a bit in question. And one can have that strange moment, which I'm sure you may have also experienced, where you transform it from a person into a Syrian person or a Mexican person, and there's this weird shift where somebody who knew you suddenly sees you differently, and you can see the racism happening right before your very eyes in a way that maybe you don't if it's more it's there's some virtue in being an outsider if you're trying to figure out other people, being used to not quite belonging in a place and looking a bit from the outside no matter where you are. I think that's helped a great deal.
It must have been helpful to you in like speaking of being white passing, like during your writing of your thesis and your research, because I know as a biracial person, I get these fucking people, man, that just get a little too comfortable around you, and they say shit to you that like, they're like, I ain't trying to. There ain't nothing wrong with mixing race. I'm just trying to preserve my race or something, some shit like that,
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, how was that possibly helpful to you during your research?
It definitely, you don't let that, those things I think ring much louder in my ears than they might otherwise, where I think I'm more sensitive to that kind of rhetoric than I might be if I was just kind of used to, or if it wasn't personal, I guess. And it also certainly is an inoculation against certain modes of thought. Like, you just can't think like that if you're biracial. You can't have any kind of idea that, like, otherwise you look at yourself as an abomination, which I suppose is always an option, but not one I personally care to take. But yeah, it's definitely like just self-evidently untrue. And also it exposes an interesting hole in alt-right logic, especially the lie they like to tell, where all they want is just, a country for the white people and a country for the black people, et cetera. Well, like, that plan gives no thought to what happens to the biracial people. Like, there is no place. So, like, what are you going to do with us all? Like, where are you going to put us? And like, I don't think I'd like the answer to that question if they answered it honestly,
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's you're right, man. I mean, I've felt that in a room shift where it's like you're not only not white enough to fit in with the white people, but you're not dark enough to fit in with like the other folks. And,
Nope.
Yeah. And so you're constantly like, fuck, man, you're constantly in the middle of this, like being pulled one way or the other. And I wonder, like, culturally, maybe these folks are kind of in the same position, right? So like, and what I mean by that is that not like if they're biracial or what have you, but there is a certain call to action around whiteness that's sort of salient in society. You have this fucking great replacement theory. You have people like Tucker Carlson talking about it. You have this sort of notion that we have to preserve the American dream, that we have to protect the Constitution, the Tree of Liberty needing the blood of the tyrants and whatever the fuck, right?
Yeah.
So you have this sort of call to action, but then you also have this sort of, no, man, everyone needs to have their place. America's a melting pot, It's, and I know this is maybe a little bit too broad, but it's almost like asking them to give up individualism in favor of the collective, which sends us back to what we were first starting about objectivism and stuff like that. Like, you cannot get individuals to give up individualism by just proposing collectivism. Like, individuals are going to fight hard for that. And so when you strike at the core of a person of individuality, and it's like, hey, this is problematic, and this is, I mean, so much of that is embedded in society. So I think that these folks might be at like a cultural tearing point where they're being drawn in two different directions that way.
Interesting. Yeah. That's a very interesting thought. Like, they're kind of like the individualism of there is no group versus the collectivism of like being part of the white race, that kind of thing. Or or like taking action towards the white race thing, like defending that culture or the perceived enemies and like outside the gates kind of thing, Yeah, no, that's a really interesting, and it gets back to that original thing where like this idea that we're all individuals, but then the enemy makes us into a collective, and then what collective is waiting for us? Well, the old European colonizer pattern of whiteness, just hanging out, waiting to be used, just a piece to be picked up. And yeah, it is weird how easily people slide into that. And you would think, right, that like that would be hard for somebody to transition from like, I'm a proud individual and everything I have is self-made, to we have to defend the white race, a future for our white children, et cetera. But like, I think it gets back to that thing where we're social creatures. We're meant to be in collectives. We're meant to be in groups. And no matter how many times you tell yourself that you don't need people, you do. And so when there's an opportunity to form that collective, I think people are going to take it. And the more individualist they think they are, I think almost the worse it is, because they've denied that part of themselves for so long that they don't have the self-awareness to see what's even happening to them.
I think it's fucking hilarious how you mentioned how like the big enemy turns the individuals into a collective, you know, because and they don't even understand. I mean, and I think it goes back to like the whole fascism dealing with things with irony, you know, like that the big enemy can be simultaneously this nefarious, powerful, rich, you know, evil Jewish person, but is also like a weak and femboy and soy drinking, you know, feminized thing. It's like these simultaneous incoherence. Like, yeah. and I think above all, like, and part of the reason why it you know, when you swing and you miss, you can't be disappointed, and you never know if you really hit the ball with this stuff, right? You never know if you're effective with these folks, and you'll probably never see if you are effective to that end. But part of the reason why I think I'm okay with swinging and missing or not seeing any results if anything happens is because I know at the core there is this fundamental incoherence. You know, like there is this cognitive dissonance which simultaneously allows two equal and opposite things to exist simultaneously that way. And it goes back to, you know, the fucking humor thing that they do too, where they say something racist and then you say, hey, that's racist, or that's, you can't say that, and they'll be like, what, it was just a joke or something, you know? So anyway, so I don't really have too much more on this, man. I feel like I've been a space cadet during this entire conversation, and it's been really difficult to pick one angle to like talk to you through, because there's so many different things about your work and your writing and your journalism and stuff that it really fascinates me. So do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap things up?
I guess something that you just said, I'd like to comment on it. It seems like a decent place to end it, which is that I think one of the things that fascism is it's a kind of intellectual virus where the normal thought processes become replaced with a single question, which is what needs to be true for me to be the good guy. And if what needs to be true for me to be the good guy is that the enemy is strong and terrifying and holding me down, then that's true right now. And if in a half an hour, what needs to be true is that they're weak and pathetic, that's true now too. And I think that is it's a hard thing to break out of, that idea. It gets to an identity thing where you have to think of yourself as maybe not always good, maybe not always right. And I think that it's easy to fall into that mode of thought no matter where you are. I think fascists are the best at it, but I don't think they have a monopoly on it. And I don't know. I think we can all maybe work on that in ourselves, myself included.
You tried to save me when I didn't need saving, but I liked how you cared, and I liked how you liked how independent I was till I depended on you. You were soft, so it didn't feel right to just push you away. You only spoke kind words to me, so how could I say you weren't treating me right? You didn't owe me anything, but you gave it anyway. You didn't owe me anything, but you gave it anyway. All this time I thought I was in control, kept saying I could stop playing your game whenever I wanted. You weren't even mine to begin with. You weren't even to begin with. All this time I thought I was in control, but I can't let you leave me alone. I stare at the mirror, wondering why it is that I'm not good enough to be the one that you show off to your friends and tell your parents you love. Sweet talk me until I break. Life's too short anyway to not live in the moment. You make me feel so high. Just one more time. Maybe you've changed, who knows? All this time I thought I was in control. Kept saying I could stop playing your game whenever I wanted. You weren't even mine to begin with. You weren't even mine to begin with. All this time I thought I was in control, but I can't let you leave me alone. Convince myself I don't feel a thing, sitting here listening while you answer your phone, telling her all the things you were saying to me when you had me alone. You let me down each time, but somehow the same line never gets old. This won't be the last time I let you lie to me with those eyes. How could I say no? All this time I thought I was in control. Kept saying I could stop playing your game whenever I wanted. You weren't even mine to begin with. You weren't even mine to begin with. All this time I thought I was in control, but I can't let you leave.